For Krima Media's Polity, I'm Sane Dlamini. Political analyst Aubrey Majiqi discusses the ANC Manifesto. So Aubrey, you don't seem convinced with the ANC Manifesto. You're even referring it like an old salad with a fresh dressing. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, Sane, I am very polite. I would never say such a thing about the ANC Manifesto. It is Duma Gqubule who used such language, referring to President Cyril Ramaphosa's stimulus package. But those analogies, in my view, make a good point. I think anyone who has been around since 1994, upon reading all manifestos since 1994, will realize that more or less, to some extent, the ANC is dealing with the same things it has been dealing with over the past 25 years. The ANC performed quite well, actually, during the first decade of democracy. It can be argued that during the first decade of democracy, most of the change was achieved. It is from the second decade of democracy that you started seeing a wider gap between what the ANC was promising and what it was actually delivering to citizens. And in the past 5 years, for both subjective and objective reasons, I think it has become more difficult for the ANC to bridge the gap between what it promises and what it delivers. Now, this manifesto makes the promise that the ANC will succeed after this election to bridge the gap between what we call the substantive dimensions of our democracy, that is the ability of our democracy to deliver a better life for all, and the administrative aspects, that is the extent to which our democracy delivers on democratic rights, on freedoms, the right to vote, and so on. Now, the gap between the substantive and the administrative, I think, has been wider over the past 5 years. So when one looks at what is being promised, one does get the impression that it's same old, same old. One does get the impression that it is old wine in new bottles. Now, ordinarily that should not matter for two reasons. Manifestos will be repetitive to some extent because they are things that can only be achieved over the long term, which means those themes will make an appearance in one manifesto after another. The second thing, it is quite possible that at some point, even if a promise is delivered, the capacity of the state has reached a point at that time to optimally deliver on the promises. And I think the problem we have, if you put aside exogenous factors, such as the state of the global economy and how it impacts on the domestic economy, and you focus on the subjective weaknesses of the ruling party and its government and the post-apartheid state, it's very clear to me that the state is not in a position at the moment to deliver optimally.
So why do you also think that the ANC cannot waffle its way out of the economic, social, and even political crisis?
You know, youth underdevelopment, I think, has become quite a critical problem in South Africa. But what it means also is that because Africa in general, and South Africa in particular, enjoys the advantage of very young populations, of a very young population, it means we are failing to leverage on this young population because we can leverage the young population for economic growth. But when young people have no opportunities, not only are you dealing with an increasingly angry youth, but they're also dealing with the problem of a lack of opportunities translating into economic underperformance. And therefore, when one looks at what the ANC is promising, There is no sign in that manifesto that the ANC will be able to deliver the kind of GDP growth that is required. And it is for this reason, partly I suspect, that ratings agencies are a bit on the bearish side when it comes to the economic promises coming out of the South African government, because they've heard these promises before. Voters have heard these promises before. And I think the question that will be facing voters is whether we should give the ANC another chance to deliver on the promise of jobs, or we should give another party a chance. I think they will stay with the ANC, not because they believe it will deliver optimally, but because the alternatives are weak, the alternatives are hollow and shallow.
But you are also not convinced that the ruling party is equal to the revolutionary task of creating an anti-colonial post-apartheid?
When you listen to the leaders of the ANC, you listen to the president, you listen to the finance minister, you get the sense that this is not a party that is committed to either a counter-hegemonic discourse and agenda or an auto-hegemonic discourse and agenda. And therefore this is not a party, and therefore this is not a leadership that is going to argue effectively for the restructuring or fundamental restructuring of economic relations in the country, and therefore the economy itself. And I've made this point before, that when you listen to the president of the ANC and the president of the country, when you listen to the finance minister, when you look at the economic policies of our government, you are left with this impression of a child who has just been bought a coloring book, has all these crayons, but the child cannot change the outlines of the picture. All she can do is to color within the outlines of the picture. I think that's where the ANC is. The ANC in policy terms cannot change the outlines of the economic picture. It can only color within those outlines.
Is that the reason why you think that the ANC should mutate from a liberation party to a modern political party? I
don't think so. In fact, the argument I'm making is that there are those who argue that the ANC is failing to change from a liberation movement to a modern parliamentary party. In my view, that argument is nonsensical. It is an idea that is imposed by democratization theorists. It is conservative, and actually it misunderstands the nature and character of the ANC. The ANC is not just a liberation movement. The ANC is a complex identity. It is a liberation movement. It is a social movement. It is a civil rights movement. After Mbeki was removed as president of the country, it became the most effective opposition party in the country. So it has a multiplicity of identities. In my view, the ANC is not failing to change from a liberation movement to a modern parliamentary party. It is failing to harmonize the different dimensions of its complex identity when they come into conflict, because some of its members rely on that part of its complex identity that will benefit them. And that is what causes the kind of internal instability of factionalism that the ANC is failing to manage.
So what would have been your ideal manifesto given the state of politics in our country?
I'm not sure that there is an ideal manifesto. For me, an ideal manifesto is effective delivery. What do they say? The taste of the pudding is in the eating. So let's start with opposition parties. Opposition parties are sitting pretty. They can promise anything. So the EFF can promise anything. The DA can promise anything. You know why? They know that after the May elections, there will not be a ruling party. So they can promise anything. Whereas the ANC, on the other hand, has had 25 years to deliver on its promise. Now, some will argue that the ideal manifesto was the 1994 manifesto. Some will argue that the ideal manifesto is the manifesto that sufficiently takes into account the current challenges facing the nation, has a good assessment of the resources that are available, does a good study and analysis of the balance of forces domestically and globally, and does an effective analysis of how, at a domestic level, we can benefit from global dynamics. For instance, the ideal manifesto is a manifesto that communicates very clearly that yes, there are constraints facing the post-apartheid state, but is able to identify opportunities within those constraints. And this I do not see in this manifesto.
In our country, we currently have 3 concurrent commissions. All are based on corruption within the ruling party. Do you think that will affect the party in any way?
I don't think that the Sandow Commission in particular, because that's the one that is animating the popular imagination, is going to have much of an impact on the ANC. In fact, there is no single factor that on its own will make the ANC underperform or improve on its 2014 performance. So I don't think on its own, the allegations, or on their own, the allegations that are coming out of the Sandow Commission will damage the ANC. If you ask me whether there are voters who will abandon the ANC because of the allegations that are coming out of the Sandow Commission, the answer is yes. If you ask me whether there are voters who voted ANC previously who will stay at home because of that, my answer is yes. Will their number be sufficient to damage the ANC and cost it in the elections? No. So the only question for me is how large or small the ANC majority will be in May. I don't believe the ANC will fall below 50%, partly because of the hollowness and the shallowness of the alternatives.
Given the flaws that we know from the ANC, do you think that maybe the opposition parties can capitalize on that and maybe gain more voters?
Well, if you look at the campaign of the DA so far, it's very clear that whoever is doing the strategizing for the DA is inept. For instance, the billboard campaign of having the names of those who died during life as Itimeni and Marikana, I think is backfiring. It sends all the wrong messages about sensitivity, particularly cultural sensitivity. It reinforces the idea that the DA is not a party that is in touch with the culture of those who are not white in this country. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that actually opposition parties in this country just have to sit back. The ANC will do the work for them, you know. To the extent that they must campaign, it is because the DA, if we are talking about the DA has had a very bad year. And the way 2019 has started suggests that it's not going to improve. And the DA has a very big problem, and that problem is Helen Zille. And I don't think the DA knows how to control or manage Helen Zille. I think there is an extent to which he is causing damage to the image of the DA. And the irony is that so far, in my view, she has been the most successful leader of the DA when it comes to attracting black voters and black people to be members of the DA. And the irony is that she is undoing that work.
And lastly, you say that the ANC must now be retired like jersey number 10. What do you mean, and who should take over? Well,
for those who are not steeped in soccer, especially local soccer, Jomo Sono, who is now the owner of Jomo Cosmos, played for Orlando Pirates. In all probability, is the best soccer player South Africa has ever produced. And when he left Pirates decided that they would retire the number 10 jersey, his jersey, until a player of equal ability or better ability than Jomo Sono comes along. That has not happened yet. So the jersey is still retired. When it comes to liberation struggles and the revolutions, the party or the movement that was leading the revolution or liberation struggle does reach a point when it can no longer add value when it comes to the new tasks of the revolution and the new direction the revolution must take. So in my view, the ANC has run its course because South Africa needs a new revolution. Some will argue that South Africa, yes, needs a new revolution, and what needs to change is the ANC so that it reconstructs itself to be equal to the challenges of a new revolution. I am increasingly gravitating towards the view that unless it loses power, the ANC will not be able to reconstruct itself.
That was political analyst Duma Gqubule speaking to Crema Media's Polity about the ANC Manifesto.